Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast, to our rebooted format of the Career Profiles podcast. This is the first episode, and we're delighted to be bringing you a story about a legendary fighter from America, Puerto Rico. He is Wilfred Benitez. He is one of the great fighters of the 1970s, 1980s, and arguably the fifth king out of those great fighters in Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran and Thomas Hearns. We've got a great story about his life, about his boxing career, but we've also got some sad parts of his life, where he currently is as well, and we've definitely got some stuff that we need to let you guys know about if you didn't already know about Wilfred Benitez. So we really do hope you enjoy the episode on Wilfred Benitez. And I know, Johnston, when we put our series together, we started looking at what fighters we could do. Wilfred Benitez's name was right up there at the top of the list.
He was, and rightly so, because he is an absolutely sublime fighter. He really is iconic in Puerto Rico, and over here at the time, in his era, he was a superb fighter, and he was different to everybody else. This guy would fight in the pocket and use just fantastic head movement. He was like a cobra at times, and it's been a pleasure watching back some of his fights on YouTube, and it really is an eye-opener. If you didn't already know about Wilfred Benitez, then I'm telling you now, this story is compelling, and it should force you to go back to YouTube and go and watch some of his big fights, because they really are a great demonstration of a tremendous fighter that he really was.
Now, we're going to begin, as always, at the very beginning, where Wilfred Benitez was born in the Bronx in New York on September the 12th, 1958. And he was the youngest out of 8 children to Clara Elena Rosa Benitez and Gregorio Goyo Benitez. Now, after bearing 4 girls, Evelyn, Cleo, Yvonne and Mary, Clara Rosa gave birth to 4 boys, Gregorio Jr., Frankie, Alfonso and Wilfred. Now, Goyo explained in 1981, "I married Clara Rosa in 1947. We had the girls first, then the boys. And I told Clara Rosa, when we had a son, that he was going to be a fighter." Now, before we do begin with the early life of Wilfred, we must give you a little bit of context to Gregorio Sr., who was born on May the 24th, 1928 in Puerto Rico, where he lived for 19 years of his life. By the time Gregorio was a teenager, he claims to have fought over 300 unsanctioned bouts on the streets for just nickels and dimes. He also declared that he sparred countless rounds in the boxing gyms and earned 50 cents per fight boxing in 3-rounders. In 1948, Gregorio decided to leave his native country for the land of the free, New York City. He found employment in a car body shop in South Bronx, where he worked as a mechanic and a paint specialist. He arrived just months after the passing of Law 53, a law also known as the gag order, which made it illegal to write or talk negatively about the local government of Puerto Rico. The act also outlawed the Puerto Rican flag, and anyone caught displaying or waving the flag would be arrested and sent to jail. Law 53 would last for 9 years until it was abolished in 1957 on the grounds that it was unlawful. Gregorio had made the right choice to leave his homeland.
As explained by Jose Corpas in the Sweet Science article, a great source for this episode, less than 3 years after Gregorio left, a series of revolts erupted throughout the island and lasted until US military bombers blanketed the citizens of Jayua and Utado with bombs and bullets, while foot soldiers tossed grenades into the backyards and living rooms. Now, after Gregorio married Clara, they actually settled down to raise a family, during which time Goyo attended many fights at Madison Square Garden and the Sunnyside Garden Arena in Queens. He also liked to hang around the local gyms, trying to gather as much knowledge as possible. And he recalled, "I went to the big fights and saw how others fight. I learned to hit the belly from Marcel Sedan. I watched Sugar Ray Robinson and learned the hook from him, the right to the body, and the double up on the hook." He enjoyed studying the famous fighters of the era, which included Emil Griffith, Carlos Ortiz, Jose Torres, and Franco Narvaez. Sometimes he would even earn a few dollars as an assistant second. But his real desire was to pass on the knowledge that he had gathered to his 4 sons. He set up boxing matches for his boys and their friends in the playground of PS 124 in the Bronx. Effectively, we would call it a controlled schoolyard fight, which took place next to the handball court. Using a piece of chalk, Gregorio would outline a cement ring, and like a circus ringman, he would persuade passers-by to pay anything from 50 cents to $1 for a show. Gregorio said he would simply ask, "You want to see these kids fight?" On a good day, he would attract up to 100 paying customers. Then he would offer the other local youths in the area to challenge one or any one of their choice of his 4 boys.
Wilfred recalled getting $1 a fight for his share of the gate, and his father said sometimes Wilfred would fight twice. And he was only 5 years old. Now, probably due to being the youngest, he was more than likely picked more than his older brothers, which meant he had to fight boys older than he was by around 2 or 3 years. These schoolyard fights continued until the South Bronx became too unbearable to live and was in a state of decay. At the start of the 1960s, the South Bronx, which was already populated with poor working-class families, soon became a poverty-ridden area. There were several factors that contributed to the decay of the South Bronx, which included the white flight, landlord abandonment, economic changes, the crime rate, demographics, and also, some believe, the construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway. The expressway would cut through the heart of the South Bronx, and many feel it also ripped its heart out with it. Then, there was the Harlem Riot in 1964, which began when James Powell, a 15-year-old African-American, was shot and killed by police. The shooting set off 6 consecutive nights of rioting between a total of 4,000 New Yorkers and the New York City Police Department. Several protesters were severely beaten by NYPD officers, and at the end of the conflict, reports counted 1 dead rioter, 118 injured, and 465 arrested. The aftermath inevitably heightened the racial tension. Damaged buildings and shops were left, which increased crime levels, and those already living in poverty turned to drugs. Therefore, in the summer of 1966, Gregorio decided to move his family out of America and back to Puerto Rico. Cleo recalled, "Dad said, there's too much crime in New York. You'll have a better chance in Puerto Rico."
Well, Gregorio said himself years later, "Too much dope, too much trouble. I told them we go home where it's not so bad." Well, that same year, Wilfred, then 7 years old and weighing 62 pounds, had his first organised fight, a draw in the Puerto Rican Golden Gloves. He said, "I never liked boxing very much then. I just boxed for my father." When the family arrived in St. Just in the Trujillo Alto district of Puerto Rico, about 30 miles south of San Juan, Gregorio built a boxing ring behind their home. Jose Corpus described the makeshift gym in 2017. He said, "Along the sides, a few punching bags hung. One of the bags, held together by duct tape, still hangs today, though the gym's roof was blown off by a hurricane." Gregorio taught his boys how to box, and his relentless regime began with his eldest son, 11-year-old Gregorio Jr., doing road work at 4 a.m. in the morning, and it wasn't long before the 8-year-old Wilfred would tag along too. Gregorio Jr. recalled he would stop halfway through the running and tell me that he was going back, and I would tell him, "It's too dark for you to go home alone. You came out with me, you have to go back with me." Their father would have the boys spar against each other regularly, and Gregorio Jr. said, "Wilfred used to cry to my father that he couldn't catch me or hit me. I told him, do the same things I do. Everything you told him to do, he did it." Gregorio was strict and demanding, but his makeshift gym attracted other young boys to join him and his 4 sons, which included Alfredo Escalara, Esteban Jesus, and Carlos de Leon. Jesus was a teenager at the time when Wilfred was 9, and it was rumoured that they would spar many brutal rounds in that backyard ring.
Although Wilfred gave as much as he got, there were times when Jesus would give him a savage beating, but instead of stopping the sparring and saving his youngest son for another day, Gregorio Sr. would let the sparring continue. It is reported that Gregorio Sr. would tell his son, the more you get hit, the more you need to spar. It was at this point that many believe Wilfred Benitez developed his radar, the ability to slip punches even when in the pocket or pinned against the ropes. He also learnt the ability to switch hit, moving back and forth from orthodox to southpaw, and he said this during his professional career, Wilfred: "I'm a natural righty, but I can fight both sides. I switch from left to right to left to confuse my opponent, but my right is where I have all my strength. I'll bust the bridge of a guy's nose with my right." Now, Wilfred's sister Yvonne told author of Adair Joffrey's autobiography and friend of the Benitez family, Chris Smith, if he was sparring someone that was being outclassed, he would take it easy and never take advantage or abuse them. She also explained that her youngest brother Wilfred was very happy and nice. That's how he always was, very playful and friendly. Gregorio Sr. taught his sons and other kids that attended his gym all the punches that he had learnt from the boxers that we mentioned earlier, as well as Rocky Marciano's overhand right and Kid Gavilan's bolo punch. But he always encouraged and prompted them to always throw those shots off the jab. From 1967 to 1970, Wilfred competed at many junior tournaments and he got used to winning regularly, which helped grow his affection for boxing, which went beyond just pleasing his father, and he explained himself: "I was in the gym all the time. I liked the discipline. You go into the gym and work out. You sweat. You develop your skills. That's what I enjoyed. Every day. Dedication. That I developed rapidly. I was 15, but it was like being 21."
Well, sometime in 1970, the Benitez family moved from their house in St. Just to another in Puerto Rico, and Gregorio wasted little time in building another gym in their backyard. A journalist from Sports Illustrated visited that family home in 1976, and he described the gym as having the look of a small airplane hangar, with yellowing newspaper clippings, old fight photographs and posters on the clean white walls. He also wrote that there were 2 rub-down tables, 3 punch bags and a homemade ring, put adjacent to the chickens who ran freely in the small yard that separated the makeshift training area from the family home. However, it was around this time that 3 of his sons began to drop away from boxing, but Wilfred continued. His desire was to win a world title. There was talk that Gregorio pushed his oldest son too hard and too fast, but later explained that he only forced young Gregorio to quit the ring because he got married. He said Gregorio Jr. was the best boxer, but he fell in love. I told him, "You get married, you no fight." Alfonso left the gym because he preferred going to school and went on to become a computer technician with a Puerto Rican telephone company. However, Gregorio's biggest disappointment was when Frankie, a one-time promising lightweight, had other interests other than boxing, which forced his father's hand. He said, "I retired him because he liked the women too much. He's crazy, but he was a tremendous fighter." Frankie sparred some with Wilfred before the Cervantes fight, and Frankie was a little faster, but Wilfred was stronger and more intelligent. Friend of the family, Chris Smith, explained that it's been said that once Gregorio saw a fighter that wasn't to his standards or likely to go far, he'd be done with them.
Well, all 4 of Gregorio's sons had fulfilled their father's wishes and all grew into professionals, but it was young Wilfred who exhibited the most promise. Goyo was still able to incorporate his self-taught skills as a coach and demonstrate that he was a top teacher when he took Esteban de Jesus to Madison Square Garden for a 10-round non-title fight against the new WBA World Lightweight Champion, Roberto Duran. Jesus became the first fighter to put Duran down when he caught him with a left hook in the first round, and he repeated that feat in the rematch. He then went on to become the first to beat the Panamanian legend, winning by decision. Please do go and check out our Legendary Nights episode on the tale of Duran and Jesus for more information on that fight and their full free-fight rivalry. Now back to Wilfred, and at the age of 14, he won the Puerto Rican bantamweight title by beating Roberto Roman Guzman in July of 1972. But following his only knockout defeat at the hands of Derek Holmes in January 1973 in the USA vs the Caribbean tournament, Wilfred decided to move up from bantamweight to featherweight. He picked up a few decent wins before losing in the Puerto Rican lightweight final to Jose Luis Vallon in October of 1973. Although Benitez had beaten Vallon twice, he also lost to him on a couple of occasions. It was one of those defeats in the lightweight final that cost him the chance to represent his country in Mexico, a tournament that Vallon went on to actually win. And Chris Smith again explained that as an amateur, Wilfred was defeated by future Puerto Rican legend Wilfredo Gomez, who was a couple of years older. And they were very good friends, he and Gomez still loves Benitez and holds him in high esteem.
Well, back to Wilfred in the current time, and still only 15 years old. Surely it would be only a matter of time before Wilfred would go on to represent his country in a major tournament. Now, by the summer of 1976, Wilfred would have only been 17 years old when the Olympic Games in Montreal, Canada came around. For us, the perfect age for a talented fighter to take centre stage, but his father could not wait any longer, and neither could he, Wilfred himself, to turn professional. Now, he told Sports Illustrated, "In the amateurs, I was 15 years old and fighting older men. I was boxing them all and beating them. Why wouldn't I become a professional?" And that's exactly what he did, what he and his father decided to do, just 10 weeks after his 15th birthday. Wilfred left the amateur game behind with a claimed record of 123 wins and just 6 defeats. So on November the 22nd, 1973, Wilfred Benitez turned professional, earning $100 by knocking out Harim Santiago in the first round in Puerto Rico. On the same bill, his brother, Frankie, and stablemate Esteban Jesus, who was the headline act for the night, also fought and won. Just 8 days later, and Benitez was back in the ring, earning a second round knockout in a little island owned by the Dutch Caribbean, Philipsburg, Sint Maarten. To say that Wilfred Benitez was an active fighter would be an understatement. He knocked out another 3 unknown opponents, 2 in January 1974 and the other in February. Wilfred was finally taken an 8-round distance in his 6th professional fight against Victor Mangula in San Juan, Puerto Rico, but went on to knock out a reported 5 more opponents before landing at the Felt Forum in New York with a record of 11-0 with 10 KOs. Interestingly, but certainly not surprisingly, it was rumoured by some sources that Wilfred Benitez had in fact fought more than 11 fights since turning professional.
It has been claimed that he was involved in another 20-odd unsanctioned fights, which were very likely to have been hosted in the Netherlands Antilles, where regulation could be breached. These extra smokers, as they called them, the accumulation of playground brawls when he was just 5 years old, and those grueling sparring sessions in his own backyard were no doubt valuable experiences for young Wilfred. However, you can't help but wonder the amount of damage he must have taken already in just a short period of time, especially when you consider that his career will continue for another 16 years. Chris Smith again explained that, in reality, they didn't know as much about CTE or delayed head trauma back in these days. It was quite normal for a father to put their kids in fights, And then when you figure out how much of a prodigy Wilfred became, it was natural they'd put him in with older kids than men because of his successes. Benítez's mother also said the same regarding not knowing about the head traumas and delayed effects, and Yvonne doesn't blame her father for the eventual sad outcome in Wilfred's life. Of course, we will come to this subject at the end of the episode, but it's important that we bring this to your attention even this early on in the show. Now, moving back to the story, the then matchmaker at Madison Square Garden was Teddy Brenner, and he recalled the time he brought Wilfred, who was already known by the Puerto Rican fans in New York, to fight Al Hughes at the Felt Forum. He had just turned 16, too young to box legally in New York, and Brenner said he had a baptismal certificate that said he was older. I didn't know how young he really was.
So there has been some confusion regarding Wilfred's exact age and his name as well, which we're going to go into, because some people call him Wilfredo. This was because of his father, who needed to convince Brenner and the New York State Athletic Commission that his youngest son was at least 18 in order to box professionally in the Big Apple. To pull the wool over their eyes, Gregorio presented the fake baptismal certificate, and it worked. There are other points of interest that we need to clear up before we can continue the story, and it all started just before Christmas in 1972 when Lou Duva of Garden Promotions sponsored the national AAU tournament between the United States amateur team and the Puerto Rican national team at the Patterson Armory. The bantamweight for Puerto Rico was reported as 16-year-old sensation Wilfredo Benitez. The story goes that the Wilfredo Benitez, who was presented as a 16-year-old in 1972 and 18 in 1974, really was Wilfred without the O, and that he was born in September the 12th, 1958, as we said at the top of the show. To add to the confusion, Gregorio called his son Wilfredo and not Wilfred because he said it was easier for him to pronounce. There is also a lack of records available from the now closed PS 124, which show that Wilfredo Benitez was born in 1956 rather than Wilfred born on September the 2nd, 58. I hope you're following this, guys. The date that makes him 16 when he fights Al Hughes. Well, at the time, Brenner didn't even batter an eyelid at this young Puerto Rican kid who was comfortably beating up grown men. And to be fair to him, it's not common that a 16-year-old to do such a thing and have the strength and skill and knowledge. So why would he question it? Nevertheless, what Brenner does remember is young Wilfred sitting in his office before the fight when he spotted a fly buzzing in front of him. "Watch this," Wilfred said, and he caught the fly in midair.
He was showing off his amazing reflexes and demonstrating his remarkable perception, which he later credited to the late, great Bruce Lee. And he said, "I like the martial arts, like Bruce Lee. I study my opponent. I stare at him. I get close enough to him so he thinks he can reach me, but he really can't. I keep looking at him, then I box him. I beat him with that. The rest is instinct and the things I've learned." Now, during these very early days in Wilfred, or as he was known for much of his earlier career, Wilfredo, Brenner actually remembers his father being in complete control of not only his son's boxing career, but his life decisions. Teddy Brenner said, if the father had told Wilfred to jump off a burning building, he would have jumped. Now, to the fight with Al Hughes, and weighing in at 144 pounds, Benitez went on to knock out Hughes in 5 rounds of a scheduled 8. On the same night, his brother Frankie outpointed Hughes' twin brother Bobby Joe. And if you think that was strange, then the following month at Madison Square Garden, Wilfred stopped Terry Summerhays in 6th round, while his brother Frankie on the same card also finished off his opponent in 6th round against Johnny Summerhays, brother of Terry. Now, in the post-fight interview through an interpreter, Wilfred expressed his gratitude to the Puerto Rican fans that are here in New York, and even the ones that didn't come to the fight. Now 13-0 with 12 victories coming by way of knockout, Benitez was back at the Felt Forum for his last fight in 1974 against Lawrence Haffey. The Canadian became the second man to take Wilfred the 8-round distance, but the result was unanimous in favour of the Puerto Rican.
Well, for the next year, Benitez knocked out 8 of his 11 opponents, armed with what Jose Corpas wrote, which is what we like, a solid punch, fully functioning radar, and a fake certificate with a forged date and an extra letter at the end of his first name. So 8 of his bouts were held in his homeland in Sem 1, Puerto Rico. 2 were actually staged in Phillipsburg, and the other was hosted at the Felt Forum in New York, which was his 3rd appearance in America. Now, one of Wilfred's most important performances and experiences came in 1975 against Santos Solis. This was his first ever 10-rounder, and some have suggested that Santos gave him a world of trouble that Monday night in San Juan, taking the decision on one of the judges' scorecards. But Benitez managed to keep his unbeaten record intact by taking a split decision victory. Wilfred followed that win up with another 10-round decision against Cuban Angel Robinson Garcia, but following a 6th-round knockout of Argentinian Omar Ruben Realicio at the Felt Forum, he took his most significant victory yet when he avenged his brother Frankie's defeat against Chris Fernandez. The fight took place at the famous Roberto Clemente Coliseum in Sem 1, Puerto Rico on December the 13th, 1975, in what became an unofficial eliminator for Antonio Cervantes, the WBA light welterweight champion. Incredibly, at the age of just 17, Wilfred Benitez was now in place to take on the Colombian legend Antonio Cervantes, who had a record of 50 wins, 9 losses and 1 draw, also known as Kid Pembele. Cervantes collected the WBA light welterweight crown in October 1972 and made 10 successful defences, beating the likes of Alfonso Fraser twice, Nocolino Loche and Esteban Jesus. The Colombian had come a long way from a poor neighbourhood where he used to shine shoes and sell contraband cigarettes just so he could eat.
Well, Cervantes explained his upbringing and said, "Shining shoes was my source of income. Back then, everyone had to take care of their shoes, and I would be there to give you the best shine around. The cigarettes were more underground, and I would make up as much money as possible there, selling to everyone and anyone." By the time Cervantes was ready to make his 11th defence against Benitez, he was 30 years old, 13 years senior than his inexperienced challenger, who had only been fighting as a professional for 2 years. Undeterred by the existing champion's vastly greater experience and age, Wilfred shrugged and said, "I've been fighting bigger and older guys since I was 8, so what's new?" In his corner, of course, was his father, Gregorio, whose training methods and credentials as a trainer were often criticised on numerous occasions. Goyo was ready for the disbelievers who questioned his expertise, and he said, "Some people learn by competing. I learn by observing. In New York, I went to all the big fights, and I see how others work, how others fight. I studied every trainer, every big fighter. For 5 years, I worked in the amateurs before my first son turned professional. I've worked over 3,000 fights, amateur and professional." However, not everyone believed that Gregorio lacked experience. Teddy Brenner gave high praise indeed when he concluded that his father is one of the best trainers around. He's a Vince Lombardi, the legendary American football coach of the Green Bay Packers. Goyo, like Lombardi had done with his team, had Wilfred motivated and believing in himself. Benitez said, "I felt I could confront anyone. Why couldn't I fight the champion? I wasn't scared of Cervantes. I used to say, boy, if I win this, I'll be the youngest champion ever. Extraordinario." Gregorio confirmed that his youngest son trained 2 months for the Cervantes fight and that it was the best he had ever trained.
And while in training, Wilfred promised his father the $7,500 purse from the fight. But Goyo recalled, "He told me, I didn't want the money. I want to be champion. Make me a champion." Wilfred reminisced on just how confident he was. "I had no doubt in my mind that I would beat him. I was in great shape and had no problem at all. I was ready to become a champion." One of the most famous nights in boxing history, which does get forgotten. occurred on March the 6th, 1976 at the Hearns Stadium in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Wilfred Benitez was ready to impress the 20-odd thousand fans in attendance that included his screaming classmates in the front row and shocked the Street Fighter come champion Antonio Cervantes. To describe the prelude to the fight and the action, we are going to use an article written by Stanley Weston and Steve Farhood for The Ring, Boxing in the 20th Century. It reads, "If you argue that great boxers are born not made, Wilfred Benitez is your prime piece of evidence." On March 6, Benitez, 25-0, challenged WBA junior welterweight champion Antonio Cervantes in San Juan. It didn't figure to threaten Kid Pembele, the Colombian who had made 10 successful defences and was being mentioned as an opponent for the incomparable Roberto Duran. Cervantes and his teenaged foe boxed evenly until Benitez's extraordinary speed and skill surfaced in the fifth. He took 4 consecutive rounds, jabbing smartly and making the champion miss with his hooks. Cervantes rallied in the 11th but couldn't maintain his momentum. After 15 rounds, Benitez, a clear winner, settled for a split decision victory. Scores of 148-144, 147-142 and 145-147. At age 17 and a half, they've added, he was too young to appreciate history but old enough to have made it. Wilfred Benitez, who became the youngest world champion in history, declared, "I made him miss, the little giant one."
That victory propelled Benitez into the most promising fighter in the world, but it was also the last time Wilfred would devote himself entirely to another training camp, and he admitted, "When I entered boxing, I wanted the championship, money, health, and women." So once he accomplished this, the boy who became a man began to act like a child. At 17, with money in his pocket and deprived of a childhood, it was a little wonder that his life would begin to go off the rails. Where this incredible victory should have been the catalyst to launch him into superstardom, the Cervantes fight became a beginning to the end for him. West Coast correspondent Steve Vender of Boxing News explained years later one distraction that Wilfred could never ignore, and that was that Wilfred loves the girls. He loves to be surrounded by women and the attention they give him. When a woman comes into the gym to watch him train, he works twice as hard. If he is doing push-ups, then he does 10, 20 more if a woman is watching. His fondness for the opposite sex was something that Vender himself noticed during his time with Benitez, and he wrote, "When it was a woman who was interested in him, Benitez's face would light up and glow, and the aristocratic aloofness about him would disappear as he spoke in soft tones and smiled warmly, all the time looking at the woman." It was obvious that this was part of being a champion that Benitez enjoyed very much. Just 12 weeks later, Wilfred made his first successful defence against Emiliano Villa, taking another 15-round decision, this time unanimously at the Roberto Clemente Coliseum in San Juan, where he earned $60,000. That victory put any doubt in anyone's mind that he was just a flash in the pan.
I mean, he's a young teenage boy with 60,000 plus in his account. Wow, in them days, he wants to enjoy himself. No wonder why he liked the ladies. I mean, it's obvious. But his father was also quick to point this out after the first defence. He said, "Can anyone doubt he is a champion now? And now we have to plan ahead. Duran? Yes, we want Duran. He has been having too much trouble making the lighter weight, but he will have to pay to fight us. And Kid Pembele wants another fight. It will cost him some money too." So it would seem that the bold statement from his father was not enough to motivate Benitez, because for the first time, Wilfred was able to enjoy the fruits of his labour. So the gap between the Villa fight and his next defence would be his longest spell outside the ring. A total of 4.5 months was his longest spell up to that point. In today's game, this would be considered an active fighter, but for Benitez in this area, it was deemed too long. And it raised the question that Gregorio had lost control of his son. However, when he did return to the same arena where he won his world title, the Harim Bithorn Stadium, Benitez showed no cracks in his armoury, dispatching Tony Petrolini in just 3 rounds. The commentator Don Majeski said in the post-fight interview, "Nobody expected you to beat Cervantes, and certainly nobody expected you to win so easily tonight." He then asked, "What do you think about Petrolini?" Responding with improved English, Wilfred said, "This fight was supposed to go 8 rounds, but when I hit that guy Petronelli, I thought, oh man, he's mine. And I think Pembele is going to go down too." So the Antonio Cervantes rematch was then agreed and scheduled as well for December the 4th, 1976. But while preparing for the fight, Wilfred was actually involved in a car accident. He actually purchased a new car and crashed it into a pair of conveniently placed trees, leaving the front end hanging over a steep cliff.
He was hospitalised briefly after suffering lacerations to his hands and bruising to his body. Goyo said at the time, "He's lucky he's still alive." Now, whilst in a period of recuperation, the fight was cancelled. The trees had saved his life, but they couldn't prevent the WBA taking the decision to strip him of the title in January 1977 after apparently refusing to face Cervantes as mandated. Some thought Gregorio had no intention of granting Cervantes another crack at his son, but whether that was true or not, we will just never know. However, the Colombian did go on to recapture the vacant crown on June 25, 1977. Although the Colombian was considered a legitimate champion by the WBA, Benitez was recognised as the lineal world light welterweight champion in the state of New York, and amongst many fans, being able to make the weight was another issue that Wilfred was finding increasingly difficult, so he decided to test the water in the welterweight division. He took on Harold Weston Jr. on February the 2nd, 1977 at Madison Square Garden, and according to the Associated Press, they wrote, he was clearly on his way to his 27th victory in 27 pro fights. The wiry welterweight was whipping jabs and combinations at Harold Weston Jr. with impunity. But then the fight turned on its head when the now 18-year-old Benitez began to piss around in the ring and sat to mock his opponent. Again, the Associated Press wrote, between the 6th and 7th rounds, something happened. The 18-year-old kid from Puerto Rico shifted from artistic to arrogant. It was like watching a miniature Muhammad Ali. Instead of sitting between rounds listening to his cornerman, Benitez stood there, smiling and gesturing at some ringsiders. From this moment on, Benitez decided that it was time to clown around, which would ultimately be a bad decision.
Yeah, the Associated Press explained that when the bell for the 7th round rang, he windmilled his right arm, then he tossed in an Ali shuffle, then he tossed a few bolo punches, then he shouted a cadence of pa, 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 as he fired home more shots. Then he stood back, smiled to basically just look back and think, how great am I, taunted Weston and gestured him to come in and mix it up. Well, what he's mocking and clowning around, I mean, the 10,000 strong crowd, they didn't like the clowning around at all and immediately turned against him. And so did 2 of the judges, Howard Lederman and Al Reed, who both scored the fight a draw, 5 each. The referee and the 3rd judge, Johnny Lou Bianco, gave it 7-3 to Wilfred, but his score was irrelevant and the official decision was a majority draw, a blemish on his record. Both thought they did enough to win, but Weston was still complimentary about his opponent. He's about the trickiest and best defensive fighter I've ever fought. He can throw 25 or 30 punches and you might not even hit with one. I was shocked. He planted himself on the ropes and I never expected any man in the world could get away from me on the ropes. He was that good. There 1 minute, gone the next. Wilfred used the next 6 months to keep active against modest opposition, winning an 8-rounder in Ohio and then knocking out a couple of guys in Virgin Islands before returning to defend his now New York State Athletic Commission World Super Lightweight title at Madison Square Garden against Ray Chavez Guerrero. The fight went to the 15th and final round, where Benitez was able to land 25 unanswered shots that put Guerrero down. The valiant challenger did manage to get back to his feet, but referee Arthur Mercante had seen enough and he stopped the bout. In the eyes of the New York State Athletic Commission, Wilfred had defended his world title for the third and last time. He would never make light welterweight or super lightweight again.
Once again, Wilfred decided to spend a few months out of the ring, but this time, instead of training in his father's gym, he began to train in nightclubs. His lax attitude showed in his next fight against the undefeated Bruce Curry in Madison Square Garden on November the 18th, 1977. Gregorio argued and pleaded with his son. "Curry will knock you out. You haven't been training. Nobody will fight Curry because he has a punch." Wilfred smugly replied, "Nah." Big punch or not, Wilfred was still the 3-1 favourite, but he misjudged his opponent's power. Curry took advantage and knocked Benitez down 3 times, twice in the 4th round, in which the bell saved Wilfred from being knocked out, and then once in the 5th, when the Puerto Rican ended up stretched over a strand of the ring ropes, half in the ring and half out. Teddy Brenner explained, "He trained about 10 minutes for that fight. He got off the deck one time with one leg walking north and the other east. There's no way he should have gotten up and continued. I don't know what carried him through that fight." Surviving the fight showed unbelievable guts and determination, but the idea that he could win the fight was a tall order, especially in just a 10-rounder. However, under New York rules, 2 judges and a referee scored the bout by rounds and not the 10 points must system that we have today. A supplementary point system was used in case the rounds were even. In the end, Judge Carol Castellano scored the fight 5-4-1 for Benitez, and the referee Arthur Mercante called it 5-4-1 for Curry, and then Judge Barney Smith had it 7-3 for Benitez, a split decision victory for the 19-year-old who kept his unbeaten record in order. Shortly after the fight, Arthur Mercante declared, "It was one of the best fights I've ever been in."
What ultimately won the fight for Benitez by a very controversial split decision was his superior boxing skills and his sixth sense that kept him from getting hit time and time again, even though he did get put down for 3 times. As painful and as embarrassing as the experience was, the Curry fight revealed a new dimension to this young kid. Cus D'Amato said, "If there was any doubt about his courage, this fight made you take your hat off to him. When he got off that floor, you wouldn't have given 2 cents of his chances." Benitez put his performance down to bad preparation, simple as that. The rematch was signed to take place the following year on February the 4th, 1978, once again at Madison Square Garden, and Gregorio did not want to take any chances, so sent Wilfred off to a secluded 4-week training camp at altitude in Mexico City, where he is said to have sparred over 100 rounds. Wilfred went into more detail as to what went wrong against Curry in that first fight. He explained the first fight was supposed to be Duran. Then Duran got sick and they said I was fighting Curry instead. And I said, "Curry who?" And I stopped working. He knocked me down 3 times. Then I knew Curry was. This time I have worked very hard. No play. Not only was the motivation there to put the wrongs right, but there was also the added incentive of a major next fight. Before the rematch, it had been reported in the press that the winner was in line to face Roberto Duran in a lucrative non-title affair at Madison Square Garden on April the 27th. Gregorio Sr., he begged to differ. "Hold on a minute, we haven't signed any contract to fight Duran. There are still a few things to discuss." The Garden were offering $60,000 compared to a $100,000 guarantee for Duran at a contract weight of 143 pounds.
That was when the strained relationship between father and son became public. Gregorio admitted, "I want to sell my kid. All I ask is $150,000. 10% of all his future purses, and 2 tickets to all of his fights. I say to all of them, you put the money in my hand, and I put my kid in your hand. After that, I don't care what you do with my kid. If the new owner wants him to fight Duran at £143, that's his worry. I want to be like Pontius Pilate, wash my hands of the whole thing. In truth, many confirm that Gregorio had a compulsive gambling problem that had placed him in tens of thousands of debt and spent a lot of time at the racetracks. It was a version of events that Teddy Brenner reiterated in his memoir, Only the Ring Was Square. He wrote, Gregorio Benitez was in horses. He owned them and played them, and when things went bad, he decided to sell the contract on his son. Wilfred said his father would often point to a lot or building and tell him that he had purchased that property for him and that he would get it when he retired. He never did. Gregorio's gambling troubles were widely reported, and the whispers were that it was his son's money that he was wasting away. Benitez's older sister, Yvonne, said those allegations were false and that her dad had no control over her brother's finances. There was another reason, according to her, his divorce in 1983, which we will come to later. Yvonne squashed rumours about her father wasting her brother's money by saying people like to talk, and that the stable of racehorses her father kept were purchased with his own money. Yvonne felt the confusion may have been caused by the fact that the stable bore the name of her brother, his youngest son.
Well, we'll come into a bit more of that in a little bit, but into the rematch against Bruce Curry, which took place just 10 weeks later. It was the American's preparations that actually caused his performance to dip this time. So just 8 days before the bout, he participated in a fight in Japan, knocking out his opponent in just 3 rounds. But he flew to Japan, has flown back, and he confessed that he was too exhausted to care about the Benitez fight. Bruce said later, I just wanted to get it done, go to bed. I should have sent out for coffee. Well, Wilfred stayed on the outside from the outset and began piling up the points before Curry could even find his feet and later in the fight his accuracy. That came in the 7th round when the Puerto Rican's legs trembled at the sound of the bell with a crashing left hook. Pat Putnam of Sports Illustrated wrote, Benitez's corner was in uproar. Leaping into the ring, the assistant trainer, Duran Manzanet, yelled, get him, he's hurt, he's hurt. Quickly, his corner hustled Benitez to his stall, sat him down and went to work with ice water and smelling salts. Manzet yelled again, he's hurt. I see that, snapped Gregorio, I see that. Well, Benitez's recovery was amazing. Curry has a big punch, he said afterwards. I have a bigger spirit. And from the 8th round on, he, as in Benitez, said, seeing Curry with his right eye was like peeking through a keyhole. Somehow, he saw enough of him to bloody his nose in the 8th round and he finished strongly to win the final 2 rounds. That was more than enough for him to win the 10-round decision, putting the nightmare of their previous bout behind him. Following the win, Gregorio was still keen about selling his son to the highest bidder, and Pat Putnam explained he first offered to sell his son's contract to promoter Don King, who said no thank you, but offered to pay him $150,000 for 2 fights.
Gregorio said, I wanted to sell him. All Don wanted to do was promote him. And Don is always in a hurry. I don't like to do business with people in a hurry, so I tell him to forget it. Then he asked Teddy Brenner to help him find a buyer, and Brenner said, are you kidding? I find a buyer, the buyer wants him to fight a certain guy, and then you tell him not to take the fight? Who is your son going to listen to, you or his new manager? Now, while Gregorio was in the process of selling his son's contract, he was still trying to get a fight against Duran. However, the WBC president, Jose Sulaiman, told him that he was next in line for a shot at WBC welterweight champion Carlos Palomino. Gregorio apparently said, referring to Ryu Sorimachi of Japan, either him, as in Palomino, or the Chinese guy he's fighting. Brenner and me will be out in Las Vegas next week to talk Palomino. Sulaiman will be there too, so why fight Duran? like they are talking about. Palomino is for a title, and Duran is for 10 rounds. If we beat Palomino, then we got a title, and then we give a chance to Duran. Only we're fighting at 147 pounds then. With all that, right now a Duran match is too dangerous. Unless Teddy gives us the $100,000 and 2 more pounds, then we fight. Neither fight would be made until the following year, so another bout was scheduled for August 25th, 1978. While Gregorio was now clearly more interested in making money off his son, Wilfred Benitez disappeared altogether while training for his fight against Randy Shields. He quietly broke camp in New York City one day to spend a week with his girlfriend in Florida.
Well, Benitez actually failed to tell Teddy Brenner that he was leaving, so he quickly became frantic. He said, "I had every Puerto Rican private detective in New York out looking for him." It was Gregorio who finally found Wilfred in Orlando, where he had spent the week in Disney World. Wilfred admitted, "I rode all the rides, I rode the submarine, I went into the past." The thing was, he said, that he had been left alone in New York with more than $1,000 in his pocket and a girl in Orlando. He said, "There went my discipline." Now, Wilfred went on to knock out Shields in the 6th round, but his father was still intent on selling him, and he suggested he, as in Wilfred, had gone bad. But it was more of a combination of Wilfred not wanting to be disciplined anymore and his father needing the money to cover his debts. So as people have suggested. Wilfred, this time, called himself a man kid or a kid man. That's how he felt at the time, all that money, and it's understandable. Well, Brenner actually summed this whole situation up perfectly. He said, "When you try to do this to an 18-year-old kid who had been disciplined all his life, you're going to get a rebellion. I've noticed it since he won the title, and people began to pat him on the back and he realised he was an individual. Rebellion set in. It happens all the time in the boxing business between father and son. Never fails." Wilfred confessed, "I listened to my father only to avert any problems. He demands a lot from me mentally and physically. I have my own mind and I get angry. I feel like I want to kill someone." Eventually, it all came to a head in the summer of 1978 after the Shields fight. Gregorio got his wish and sold his son's contract for a pathetic and measly $75,000 to Jimmy Jacobs and Bill Caton, who initially rehired his father as a trainer for approximately that 10% of all purses as well that he wanted.
The $75,000 Jacobs and Caton paid for the contract turned out to be an absolute steal, as Wilfred would go on to make an estimated $6 to $7 million in his career. There have been different versions on how Wilfred ended up with the new trainer, so we're going to try our best to explain. The change in management, at least in the beginning, didn't make an immediate impact, so to install some much needed discipline into their new signing, Jacobs sent Wilfred to an upstate New York training camp owned by none other than Cus D'Amato. Now this is where we have a grey area, because some suggest that Jacobs and Caton hired Emil Griffith as a trainer and named Cus as a special advisor. Jacobs explained Cus's role by saying, "Cus is above the trainer. Cus supervises the overall training, not just the physical aspects. He gets more into the psychological aspects." Others indicate that Gregorio called Griffith and invited him into camp because he remembered that Emil was a well-conditioned fighter and he hoped that his influence would rub off on his son. Either way, what we do know is that Wilfred did arrive at the Catskills and that D'Amato and called on a young Teddy Atlas to assist with the training. Teddy Atlas recalled, "Wilfred Benitez was brought to D'Amato and he gave him me to train for the Carlos Palomino fight. When I trained Benitez, it was because I was with Cus and he had confidence in me." Even after only a brief time with Wilfred, Atlas declared that Benitez was the most complete package and most gifted guy he had ever worked with. Cus also admired his talent enormously, but he also concluded, "This fellow has a terrible ego. He won't admit there are some things about boxing that he doesn't know."
Well, Benitez acknowledged but then countered. He said, "I don't train because they keep on repeating things over and over. I already know all these things. I do my own thing. I don't need all this training. I'm professional. I only have to maintain my speed, my movement. Well, the real reasons for Wilfred's short period at Catskills didn't come down to his training methods or his lack of discipline. It was an accumulation of things. So when he arrived, he brought a large entourage with him. And let's just say they were not the cleanest of guests. So what we're going to do now is we're going to describe Mike Tyson, who was there at the time, young kid, his version of what it was like living with Wilfred and some of the stories that come of it. So this is as he explained in his book. So Benitez had the reputation in boxing circles of being a head case, a wacky, strutting, macho kid not playing with a full deck. Handling Wilfred Benitez took its toll in aggravation, since the father insisted that he remain involved in his son's career as the boy's trainer. Apparently unfamiliar or unconcerned with the conventions of civilized society, the Puerto Ricans turned things upside down at the house. Now, one member of the entourage of the group would wake up between 4 and 5 every morning and begin his practice martial arts, complete with loud screams and whoops, waking everybody up. He, as in the martial arts friend, also had a charming habit of blowing snot from his nose right onto the floor and just leaving it there. Wilfred himself would spit on the floor around his bed. He would also gorge himself on his favourite diet of chicken, beans and rice, to the point where he would sometimes throw up or get stomach cramps and shit all over the toilet, leaving his mess unflushed until someone would discover it the next morning. At dinner time, the Benitez entourage did not bother with utensils either. They used their hands for everything.
Tyson continued to explain, and it's in chapter 5, The Catskill Years of his books, and he says, when the other boys in the house complained about this behaviour that was turning the place into shambles, Cuss tried to explain to them that these people came from a different culture. As Cuss put it, all these people knew was how to cut sugarcane all day and screw their women at night. Benitez also began a hot pursuit of a 13-year-old girl in town, until Cuss put a halt to it by explaining that although this might be acceptable behaviour in the islands, in a small country town it could land you in jail for a statutory rape, or perhaps provoke the girl's family to come after you with shotguns. However, the final straw came one day when Camille was trying to clean up. She had noticed that her expensive towels had been disappearing. While cleaning Wilfred's room, she found a pile of them, along with a stench. When she examined more closely, she was repulsed. It seems that Wilfred had been using them to wipe his rear end after bowel movements, and then just dumped his excrement-covered towels in his room. Camille was enraged, and it was not long before Benitez and his merry men were sent packing. Benitez lasted just 1 month, and Cuss briefly explained he was lonesome, he couldn't go to town, couldn't have his girl up here, nothing meant anything to him but having a good time. Now, with Cuss no longer involved, Emil and Gregorio took the reins to prepare and work Benitez's corner when the young Puerto Rican would get an opportunity to fight for his second world title in a second division. But before the Palomino fight, which had already been signed, the champ got $465,000 and Benitez got $90,000. Jacobs and Caton decided to give their new protege a stay-busy fight against a dangerous puncher, Vernon Lewis.
So their gamble actually almost backfired in round 4 when Vernon Lewis had Benitez out on his feet, but he somehow survived and managed to stagger back to his corner. His dad knew his boy was in trouble and went to work massaging his legs. His underdog opponent must have been in confident mood when the bell sounded to begin round 5, but he was left disappointed. Once again, just like in that first Curry fight, Benitez showed amazing recovery skills and came out for the 5th like nothing had happened. He then went on to win the fight comfortably by unanimous decision, effectively saving the big fight with Carlos Palomino as well in the process. However, a rift had been created in camp when Wilfred apparently insisted that Emil train him for the fight and not his father. He actually told Griffith, "Now, you make me champ." And Gregorio and Griffith were now at loggerheads on a daily basis. Emil urged caution and advised against trading with Palomino. Don't go for the knockout. Palomino is dangerous one-punch fighter. He punches over punches. Keep your hands up and fight to go the distance. Be sharp. If you listen to me, you'll win. Gregorio dismissed the safety first advice and insisted all Griffith does is tell him about how it was when he was the champion. Wilfred doesn't listen to him. He only listens to me. Well, the mixed messages and advice must have been difficult to navigate, but when Wilfred was in camp and not absent from camp, Griffith trained Benitez to shorten his punches at the homemade gym behind the family home in San Juan. Griffith tried to avoid any confrontations with Gregorio, and each day he would quietly work with Wilfred and then return to his hotel in the city. The fight for the WBC welterweight title was held at the Harim Bithorn Stadium in San Juan, Puerto Rico, on January the 14th, 1979.
In the first 4 rounds of the fight, Benitez did as Griffith had instructed, and he boxed perfectly. The champ assumed Benitez would force the action, predicting, "I think he's going to come at me right away with a rush and try to get lucky with one punch." Realising he was wrong, Palomino decided to force the action in the 5th, but when he finally connected with Benitez, the bell rang to end the round. Pat Putnam reported for Sports Illustrated and said, in the 6th and 7th rounds when Palomino reached back, he discovered there was nothing there. He said later, "I don't know if it was the heat or the long layoff or what, but I couldn't move the way I wanted to. I was slow. I could only throw one punch at a time. There was no combinations." His manager, Jackie McCoy, agreed that his fighter had no zip, no spark, no fire. He just didn't have a thing tonight. Palomino later admitted that he found his style difficult to solve, and he said, "All through the fight, I felt like I would knock him out. I kept saying, the next round, and then the next round, but I was just missing him. I just felt it would take a little time. But by the 8th, I began to feel that he knew what punch I was going to throw before I even threw it. He had like a sixth sense. I never fought anybody with that sixth sense. He didn't move much, just enough to make you miss. It was like he had radar." Now continuing with the Pat Putnam description, he said, as Palomino tried to step up the pace, Benitez recalled thinking, "Oh, here he comes." Then a round later he thought, "He hasn't got it. He can't hurt me. He's mine." From that moment, the fight was as good as over.
Well, now less cautious, Benitez began to punch in combinations, stinging but not stunning. And the jab, the beautiful jab, quick and deadly, was snapping Palomino's head back time after time. From the 12th round on, McCoy was telling Palomino, "You're going to have to knock him out to win." But it was not to be. In the last 2 rounds, knowing Palomino didn't have enough left to hurt him, Benitez backed to the ropes, and there he planted himself, supremely confident, hitting and being hit, and knowing that within a few minutes he'd be the new WBC welterweight champion. When the official scorecards were announced, Harry Gibbs, Great Britain, scored the fight for Benitez by a margin of 146 to 143. But then came the controversy. So Zach Clayton, a resident of Philadelphia, who was the 3rd man in a historic fight between Ali and Foreman, had the champion 3 points clear of a total of 145 to 142. When Clayton's score was announced, Howard Cosell, who called the fight for ABC, said, "I should like to talk to that Mr. Clayton about that." And by the account of Michael Katz representing the New York Times, the anger of the crowd could be measured by the debris suddenly flying through the air. Prompted by a colleague from Sports Illustrated, Katz rushed to safety in anticipation of a full-scale race riot before the referee Jay Adson's card was announced. His card was 147-143 to the new W, as Cassell liked to say, the new WBC welterweight champion, Wilfred Benitez. Well, Wilfred was actually asked during the post-fight interview in the ring if he was surprised by that split decision verdict. And he told Cassell, "I won the fight and I don't care about the decision. They gave a split decision because he is a great fighter and they didn't want him to lose too bad." Wilfred also apparently said that he just wanted to shake Howard Cassell's hand because Cassell was a great man. And Clayton, well, his score was rightly scrutinised by anyone.
Pat Putnam called Clayton's score a shocker, and he wrote, "The decision shouldn't have been close." Reflecting on the fight in a 2006 article, Michael Katz wrote, "I watched as the self-proclaimed Bible of boxing put on a clinic. The art of self-defense was never more pervasive. The masterful Benitez won at least 12 of the 15 rounds. Then they announced a split decision. The crowd moaned. Now there are some ring officials of whom the late Frankie Carbo, the mobster who pretty much ran boxing in the 50s, would say, 'See that guy? I can buy him for a cup of coffee.' I'm not saying Clayton was one of these. I'm not saying he wasn't either. After the Benitez fight, I confronted the Philadelphian, who was better known as a referee. I demanded that he explain his strange scorecard, and he said, 'You've got to count body punches. Palomino was a fine body puncher, but in this fight, Benitez landed most of those shots. His elbows took care of Palomino's.' I pressed on with the interrogation. Finally, Clayton said, 'Well, the sun was in my eyes.'" Bob Arum, who promoted the fight, was furious over Clayton's score, and he moaned, "Nobody in their right mind could have scored that fight for Palomino. I know Palomino. He was a great champion. But you watched that fight, and I watched that fight, and there is no doubt that Benitez won it." He then accused rival promoter Don King of trying to fix the fight when he said, "We had heard rumours that Zach Clayton was under the influence of Don King and Bill Daly, who was King's Puerto Rico representative, and they wanted Palomino to win. He believed that King wanted Palomino to win because he was available to sign with King after the fight, unlike Benitez, who was committed to Arum."
Well, Daly denied that he wanted Palomino to win. He declared, "I was sitting in the front row rooting for Benitez all the way. I sure wish I could own all the referees. That would be some business." Well, Clayton also denied Arum's charges. "If we're such good friends, how come he, as in Don King, has never given me a fight to work?" Maybe there was a potential fix in here, or maybe it was just bad judging. Either way, Howard Cassell rounds off the Benitez performance in his 1986 autobiography, I Never Played the Game, writing, "It was one of the most beautifully executed fights that I have ever witnessed." And you know what? Go on YouTube and watch this, guys, if you haven't. It really is a stunning performance. Amazingly, Wilfred admitted that he was ill prepared for the fight, believe it or not. You watch the performance, it's insane how good he is. And he claimed 2 years later, "I was out of shape for Palomino. Palomino is a great fighter, and halfway through the fight, I felt my legs give out. I fought on the ropes because I was tired and my legs had gone." It's incredible to think that Benitez looked at his elusive, brilliant best as he masterfully counterpunched his way to a decision. His dominance over such a formidable foe is one of the several marks of his greatness. The new champion made his first defence 2 months later against Howard Weston in their rematch. However, preparations for the rematch were non-existent. Gregorio had now left his son due to the lack of commitment, and Emil Griffith had also left. The only assistance he had came in the form of his older brother, Gregorio Jr., who remained in his corner. Now, during the fight in San Juan, Gregorio was at a racetrack on the outskirts of the city when someone shoved a radio in his ear, telling him that his son was losing to Weston. Unable to restrain himself, Gregorio dashed from that track and drove to the stadium.
He arrived by the end of the 9th round, leaped through the ropes between rounds and confronted his son, slapping Wilfred's face, and he yelled, "Hey, what's the matter with you? Get out there and kill that guy." His motivational words and slap obviously helped Benitez come on strong in the championship rounds against the now tiring Weston. Benitez Sr. was still unhappy at the end of the 10th, telling his son, "This fight is not going well." Then in the 11th, he saw fit to slap his son a couple of more times, which freshened up Wilfred, and he went on to take a unanimous decision on the cards and retain his world title thanks to his father. Benitez did credit his victory to his conditioning, but also to his father, urging him on before the 11th and 12th rounds. Next up was a welterweight super fight, and one that Wilfred was confident of winning. Two undefeated fighters faced off. The WBC champion Wilfred Benitez, who's now 38-0-1, and Sugar Ray Leonard at 25-0. The magnitude of this world welterweight title fight between Benitez and Ray Leonard at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, it was one of rarity that was completely unique. To have two such superstars competing at the same time, in the primes of their careers and in the same division, well, it's only something you can dream of.
Dream fight that come true, and Leonard was the 3-1 favourite despite Benitez being the most experienced fighter. But he wasn't bothered. I don't care if he's favoured, I'll knock him out. He won't take my punch. He's just a boxer. I'm the Bible of boxing. He's a great boxer, but this time he's fighting with the champion. After the two sides reached an agreement, the deal was inked for the fight to take place on November the 30th, 1979. And what a deal it was. A whopping $1.2 million for Benitez and $1 million for Ray. Both record paydays for non-heavyweights. With the WBC, the Ring, and lineal welterweight titles all on the line, you would have thought that Wilfred Benitez would have remained focused. Well, as the fight approached, Gregorio criticised his son for not training properly, even writing in an article for the Ring that began, "He can't win this fight." He then went on to say, "Both my wife and I are very disgusted with Wilfred. Even if they gave me $200,000 to work in the corner, I would not. He has not listened to anything I have told him. He would rather be out somewhere, anywhere other than the gym. I have told him many times that Leonard will be in top shape and in top form, and that Leonard will beat him if he doesn't train." Then he claimed his intentions were to make his son work harder. He then said, "If I tell him he's going to win, Wilfred won't work hard. Now I think nobody can beat him. He's in the best shape of all." So he's using reverse psychology there. It would seem that Wilfred didn't train. He later admitted that to Ray Leonard, and one of his team also confirmed it too, by saying it was hell to get him to train. He thought because he was Wilfred Benitez, he didn't have to train.
The quote goes on to say, "I remember his father saying to him, 'Who do you think you are fighting? A nobody. Leonard is a monster created by American TV, and you have to beat him convincingly.'" With trouble keeping Wilfred in camp, Gregorio decided to kick Emil Griffith, the chief trainer, out of camp and replace him with himself. But to be fair to him, maybe he felt that his influence would help keep Benitez in camp long enough to actually make a difference. Of course, we'll never know that for sure. Now we are going to move into the fight, and once the two welterweight kings stepped into the ring, and before they engaged in battle, you'll see one of the greatest stare-downs in boxing history. Wilfred, as he did many times, stared down his opponents like he was sizing them up, but as he locked eyes with the challenger, Leonard broke it off with a wink. Now into the fight itself, and we will use a description from William Knack for Sports Illustrated, and it reads, "Leonard began moving and jabbing, and it appeared that he had found his target, that this might be an early evening. In the first round he tagged Benitez with a sweet hook that came off a jab and a right hand, rocking the champ backwards. But Benitez got away. In the third, Leonard caught him again, this time with a cleanly delivered left jab. Benitez went down on the seat of his pants. Up quickly, he took a standing 8 count, and at the bell, he walked to his corner, smiling sheepishly." William Knack continued and wrote, "Benitez found Leonard with 2 right-hand leads in the fourth, and suddenly Leonard was fighting a different man. Leonard stated, 'I wasn't aware I was in a championship early because I hit him so easy. But then he adjusted to my style. It was like looking in a mirror. And Leonard was having trouble hitting his man, especially with the overhand right. Benitez slipped one after another, dipping under them.
Well, from then on, Leonard spent most of the fight landing thin air, forcing Angelo Dundee to instruct, go downstairs. You can't stand in front of him and hit him with your right hand. But he's right there, Sugar Ray replied. Dundee replied, yeah, he's right there, but then he ain't. And William Nack again, on his report, said in the 6th round, they clashed heads. But fortunately for Leonard, the blow raised only a bump. Unfortunately for Benitez, it opened up a gash. Blood flowed down his face. Benitez was suffering from another problem as well. He had injured his left thumb early in the fight, and by the 7th round, he was shaking his left glove at his side. Well, by the 9th round, Leonard finally found the mark and forced Benitez to the ropes, where he connected with a flurry of punches. In the 11th, he caught the champ with a hook, but still he could not sustain the pressure. Late in the fight, Leonard finally opened a sizable lead. And while the fight was already a classic, round 15 proved an especially thrilling finale. Benitez, sensing he needed a knockout to win, took the fight to Ray Leonard, attacking with a series of left hooks. The challenger responded, and for 2 minutes it became a toe-to-toe war, with both men connecting to the delight of the crowd. Then, with the final bell approaching, Leonard struck with a hard left, and the champion hit the canvas for the 2nd time. Wilfred rose, with a grin of resignation more than anything, feeling more fatigued than hurt, and then retreated to the ropes as Leonard attacked. With only 6 seconds left in the 14th and final round, the referee Carlos Padilla stopped the fight while Howard Cosell rejoiced. Sugar Ray Leonard has claimed his first world championship. It was Benitez's only loss in 44 fights.
Despite the fact that there were only 6 seconds left of the fight and that Leonard was up on all 3 judges' scorecards, Jim Jacobs wasn't upset with the stoppage, and he said, "I'm glad he, as in the referee Carlos Padilla, stopped the fight. I didn't want the fighter to get hurt." Dundee was full of praise at what he had just witnessed, and he said, "From a technical standpoint, there was more done in this fight than I've seen done for a long time. You saw 2 smart, scientific fighters, 2 champions in the ring at the same time. They brought the best out of each other." Wilfred Benitez praised his victor and said, "Sugar Ray is the best in the world now. I was happy to get a fight with him. He was a great challenger and will prove to be a good champion." Years later, Sugar Ray confessed that this was maybe my best performance, but I needed it against Benitez. He consistently slipped my right-hand shots and countered beautifully and caught me with several shots, including one in the 7th round. He told me after the fight he hadn't trained at all, and afterwards I was so exhausted and dehydrated I had to go to the hospital. Years later, I visited him at his home outside San Juan and found him sitting in a chair, his eyes glazed. His mother asked him if he had recognised me, and he only said, "He beat me." Because it was his first loss, the Leonard fight proved pivotal in Benitez's career, and he admitted, "After Leonard made all that money, that changed me." He also felt the need to avenge his loss to Leonard, but unfortunately, they never fought again. At the turn of the new decade, Wilfred decided to move up to 154 pounds, and immediately got back to winning ways with 2 stoppage victories against Johnny Turner and Tony Schiavone.
And it was after his Schiavone win that Wilfred created another nickname for himself when he told Ferdy Pacheco, "I want Roberto Duran. Roberto Duran, he's afraid of me. I am the Dragon," which is another one. The Barber, the Boxing, the Dragon, and El Raider. 3 names. But 6 weeks earlier, Duran had sensationally dethroned Leonard in an epic slugfest called the Brawl in Montreal. Check it out, done a legendary night on it if you haven't already. And 24 hours later in Detroit, Thomas Hearns would annihilate Pepino Cuevas in just 2 rounds to take the WBA welterweight title. Pacheco asked if he could still make the 147 pounds without forfeiting his increasing man strength. And in broken English, Wilfred Benitez responded, "If I train hard, if I have more dedicate with boxing and training, I think I'm not gonna have a problem to become champion again. To complete 1980 unbeaten, Benitez outpointed a guy called Pete Ranzani in Sacramento, which set up a couple of opportunities for him. One was a fight with Tommy Hearns. An offer was actually made to Jim Jacobs, but from Bob Arum with the guarantee of $750,000, but he turned it down. Asked if Benitez had any input in the decision, Jacobs responded, "Of course not. When we took over Benitez's contract, we made a deal with him and his father, Gregorio, who trains him. He doesn't discuss with me how he'll fight, and I don't discuss managerial decisions with him." Instead, he chose for Benitez to fight the WBC Super Welterweight champion, Maurice Hope, on May the 23rd, 1981, for $175,000, over $500,000 less than he would have earned with the Hearns offer. Jacobs explained why he refused Bob Arum's deal, and he said, "Why would we take less to fight Hope than to fight Hearns? The answer is in 2 words: 10 years. That's the difference between fighting an undefeated 22-year-old and a 32-year-old. There is a difference between Thomas Hearns and Maurice Hope, and Wilfred would be going for his 3rd world title. Not since Emery Armstrong has anyone won 3 world titles."
Jacob's other concern was Wilfred's weight. I knew the agony he had making £147 for Leonard. Wilfred is only 22 and still growing. Days before the fight, Jim Jacobs later revealed Wilfred suddenly broke training, stole off and took a 3-day vacation to my amazement. But then the manager admitted, "I agree that he is unreliable sometimes, but I still think he is the greatest fighter in the world." Wilfred was interviewed by Gil Clancy in his dressing room ahead of the CBS Saturday afternoon broadcast, which was at the Caesars Palace Sports Pavilion in Las Vegas. The question that was asked was, what would it mean to you, as in Benitez, to join the elite band of men who laid claim to a trilogy of world championships? Now Benitez, he murmured this response: "It make me feel very great, like a boxer, and I think this is a chance in my life to win another title and bring it back to Puerto Rico." At the time he's answering the question, Gregorio Sr. is lacing up the left glove. Now as soon as Benitez entered the ring, he rushed over to Hope's corner, where he stood, hands on his hips, and began glaring at the champion. Finally, referee Richard Green came over and pushed Benitez towards his own corner. "You're going to lose," Benitez shouted over his shoulder. Hope confessed. While the referee was giving us instructions, he pushed me, and that riled me. I forgot about the pace and wanted to kick his face in. The fight was actually an even affair after the first 4, but then it turned into the Wilfred Benitez show after that, as he began to brutalise the defending champion. Then came a bizarre interlude, as explained in Sports Illustrated. Benitez came out for the 7th, with his trunks strangely bulging. Noticing the bulge, Green stopped the fight and sent Benitez back to his corner, where his handlers removed an ice bag they had neglected to take from inside his trunks.
Green actually said later, I didn't know what it was. When I saw the top of the ice bag, I just couldn't believe it. But in the 12th and final round, Benitez threw a hook to the body, which backed Hope onto the ropes near his corner. Benitez moved in swiftly and smashed a thunderbolt right cross flush against Hope's jaw. The challenger started to throw another punch but stopped as he watched Hope fall senseless to the floor. Green started the count, then stopped to wave Benitez back to a neutral corner. Green said later, "I turned to pick up the count and I saw it didn't matter. Hope was out cold." Hope was actually unconscious for 3 minutes. When asked how it felt to see Hope unconscious, Benitez replied, "Outside the ring, he is my brother. But this is business, big business. I hit him too much, plenty hard. When I hit him the last time, I feel it through my hand. It felt good. Suppose you're in the ring. How you feel? Great, right? We are boxers. Here now, we are brothers. But in the ring, forget it. Now I want Sugar Ray Leonard. We'll make many millions of dollars, enough to buy Puerto Rico. Then the middleweight title. Though after this, Marvin Hagler will want to step up a division. Well, reacting to the news that his opponent had lost a few teeth. So Hope actually lost a tooth in sparring a week before the fight, one in the second round, and a third in the 9th round. And Wilfred actually resorted to his native Spanish, which ended up translating into, he can put the teeth under his pillow for the tooth fairy. Wilfred Benitez had now become the first fighter in 44 years and the first and youngest ever to win world titles in 3 divisions. His name went down in history with the likes of Bob Fitzsimmons, Tony Canzonieri, Barney Ross, and Henry Armstrong.
Many who witnessed Wilfred's performance were full of praise. UK promoter and manager Mickey Duff said, after seeing this tonight, I'm more convinced than ever that it was making the weight that beat Benitez in the Leonard fight. The guy punched too quickly for Maurice, and it would be the same if he met Hagler. I'm absolutely positive he would win that one. Carlos Palomino said, he has become an artist. He was not a puncher as a welterweight. He was throwing like slaps at me, and he never hurt me, but I think he has reached his full weight and has matured as a puncher. That right hand he hit Hope with was no fluke. He is one fantastic fighter. And of course, his father, Gregorio, joined in and said, tonight was my son's finest fight. Winning a world title for the first time was sweet, but this was Wilfred's greatest hour. Now, there are so many things we can aim for and achieve. 6 months later, Wilfred was back in the ring, making his first defence of the WBC Super Welterweight title against Carlos Santos. The rivalry between the two Puerto Ricans was actually quite fierce, and it was fuelled even further when Wilfred declared, I'll knock him out. I'll kill him. I'm going to make sure he goes to the cemetery. It was completely out of character for Benitez to say such a vile thing, but we know just how vicious and spiteful the Hispanic rivalry can actually get, and this one was no different. Interestingly, Benitez had already signed to meet Roberto Duran for global Latin bragging rights on January the 30th, 1982. Now, Benitez went on to score a 6-round knockdown en route to a unanimous decision over Santos in Las Vegas. He was then asked by Larry Merchant if he was unhappy with his performance, and Wilfred replied, yes, I'm happy. I don't care if the people like it, but next time, I hope I will make it better. Against Roberto Duran, I will continue training, and I know that I can beat him easy.
So next up for Benitez was the Duran fight, who had returned to Panama in disgrace following the Leonard rematch. He begged his manager, Carlos Aleta, for a second chance. No, said Aleta. Then he relented. Aleta explained. In New Orleans, Duran had surrounded himself with bad people. I told him that if he wanted to fight again, first he must get rid of that entourage. It took 9 months before the last one was gone. Then he came to me and I said I would help him. Duran was now on a mission to recover any dignity he had lost following that no-mass loss to Ray Leonard in their rematch 14 months earlier. After spending his training camp next to a Panama prison, he had rekindled his desire in boxing once again. Even Ray Arcel was convinced to rejoin Roberto Duran's camp, who said he is the best conditioned Roberto Duran I ever saw. Now, if anyone had a worse reputation for lackluster training than Duran, well, it was Wilfred Benitez. But surely the $1.4 million earnings he would keep Wilfred focused. And by some accounts, he was working hard in Puerto Rico. Jimmy Jacobs jokingly admitted when Benitez lost the welterweight title to Leonard in '79, he trained 3 days, and I'm not sure about 2 of those. Sports Illustrated went to visit Benitez while he was in training camp, and the article explained how it was going and explained that his dad was actually at this time behind the wheel of his 1979 Bronco, driving along the highway, leading the hills into the south of St. Just, and ahead of him, running steadily, is Wilfred and Gregorio Jr., who is running backwards and throwing punches in air, as his father had taught him to do so long ago. There is less than a month until the fight of Duran, and the father, who is again his son's trainer, doesn't like the way Wilfred has been training.
Goyo believes Wilfred will be in better shape for the Duran fight than he had been in 3 years, but Goyo also views Duran as dangerous, and he said, "Peligro, peligrissimo. We've got to be in great condition." 2 days before, as Wilfred finished sparring 6 rounds in the gym, his father complained, "That's not enough. Right now, he should be doing 15 rounds. He didn't run enough today. He ran a mile by himself. When I run with him, I make him run and throw punches." Wilfred admitted, "Nobody can show me how to box but my father. He pushes me. You have to train me hard. The way my father trains me is the best." But it hasn't been an easy relationship, and never will be again. Goyo watches Gregorio and Wilfred, who is chugging forward, his arms and hands held in the attitude of a runner. Goyo whips the bronco out and pulls even with Wilfred. "Tira golpes," the father yells. That is, throw punches as you run. Wilfred doesn't even acknowledge it. "Tira golpes." The son stares ahead, expressionless. The father tries a 3rd time again. Nothing. The son jogs on, as if his father wasn't even there. "Ah," says the father in disgust. He presses hard on the accelerator and leaves the son behind. During this time, there was a wave of celebrity kidnappings in Puerto Rico. Then one night the telephone rang in the Benítez house, and Gregorio answered. "We have kidnapped Wilfred. See. We want $1 million. See. Or we'll kill him." "Kill him," Gregorio said, deciding it was a hoax call. Thankfully it was, and Wilfred was still safe in training. However, there was something that he took more seriously, and that was a warning that the Panamanians intended to use voodoo against his son on the premise that Gregorio Sr. was a witch.
Well, according to Pat Putnam, writing for Sports Illustrated, Gregorio had posted extra guards and was constantly searching for suspicious powders or marks on the doors. But back to the fight business, and Benitez said he had put in 2 full months of hard work this time. His father responded that it was 1 month, not 2, but also declared that his son had sparred 400 rounds and had run 200 miles preparing for Roberto Duran. Benitez then said, reciting his favourite line, "I am the Bible of boxing. I know all the techniques, all the styles. I'm the champion. I know everything exactly. I have no plans against Duran, just preparing myself. He'll come out the same way as always, to the body, fighting me against the ring posts, attacking me. That is his fight, throwing hard to surprise his opponent, to set him off balance, to get on top of him. But he won't with me. He's going now to confront the Bible of boxing, the king of technique." Speaking days before the fight in his Las Vegas hotel suite, Wilfred told an interviewer, "I have trained right. I've lost the weight by training instead of just not eating, but this weight is too hard to make anymore. But I feel strong because I have worked very hard at this weight, and I, and not Duran, will have the hands of stone." And reiterating his desire to conquer new worlds, he had promised, "This is my last fight at junior middleweight, and it is very important. After this fight, I want to become a middleweight and beat Marvin Hagler for the 4th title. For this, I must be disciplined." When asked about his son's discipline, Goyo snapped, "I got nothing to say about that." But then he immediately contradicted himself and said, "I think he could have trained better this time."
Gregorio continued and said, "This is going to be a furious fight. This is a fight for Latin America, and the Americans are all eager to see my champion beat Duran. We have to beat him any way we can. Kicking if we have to. Duran's a dirty fighter. Everybody knows he's a street fighter. All of Wilfred's fights have been clean." At the final press conference, Goyo told Duran scathingly, "We have trained to fight 15 rounds, just in case you decide not to quit in the 8th round. Taking the barb in good humour, Duran laughed and informed the assembled media, "After I beat Wilfred, I'm going to get Don King to sign my father to fight his father." Regarding the remark as aggressive, Wilfred jumped out of his seat and attempted to get at Roberto, who laughed some more. All of Benitez's clowning just proves he's afraid of me. I sleep nights. I am sure he doesn't. Duran effectively saw Benitez as a stepping stone to the revenge he craved, and he conceded, I'm fighting Benitez to get one more chance at Ray Leonard. Leonard is my ultimate goal. 9 months before his shock retirement, Leonard agreed that he was living in both fighters' heads rent-free and said, they'll be throwing punches at each other, but they'll really be aiming at me. They know where the pot is. I'll probably accommodate the winner. Jim Jacobs explained his fighter's inspiration and he said, it's not so much the title that is motivating Wilfred. He knows about Duran as a legend, and now Wilfred wants the glory and the recognition as the greatest Latin fighter. Leonard, who was providing colour commentary for box office television on HBO, favoured the champion. But only if he doesn't fight Duran the way I fought him in Montreal, he said. And the bookies agreed with him and had Benitez as the 9-5 favourite.
The fighters had a combined record of 117 wins and just 3 losses. 2 of them to Sugar Ray Leonard and 1 draw going into the fight. Pat Putnam again describes the opening moments poetically. Just before the first bell, Benitez, who had been scrolling across the ring at Duran, turned and winked at Leonard. Then, with a 2.5 height advantage and those marvellous reflexes that he calls radar, he went to work. Still using the excellent writing from Putnam, Duran came out firing, but Benitez is a bewildering target. He stands straight up, barely moving, appearing no more difficult to hit than, say, the ring post. But when you swing, and he is gone, sometimes by no more than a fraction of an inch, but gone. Superb head. The head movement's amazing. So Benitez, the early pace setter after 5, he was so confident that at the sound of the bell at the end of the 4th, Putnam wrote that he hit Leonard with another wink. Duran took the 7th, but Wilfred cut Duran's left eyelid and jarred him with a right uppercut in the 7th. Duran was tiring due to the excellent bodywork by Benitez and was losing the fight clearly. In the 12th, a butt opened a small cut on the side of Benitez's left eye. Then in the 13th, Duran came out minus his mouthpiece, but still continued to fight his heart out, and the crowd loved him for it. The last round, Benitez had the fight won and could have stayed away from the dangerous Duran. Even though he was exhausted and hardly able to hold his arms up, yet he showed courage and heart working away at Benitez in a neutral corner. For the most of the final 3 minutes, they went toe-to-toe in a full-blooded exchange. But it was a masterclass display from Benitez, who spent the last minute with his back in the neutral corner, outfoxing and out-punching the superb Roberto Duran with ease.
All 3 judges called it for Wilfred Benitez, but the scores were way too close. Lou Tabat had it 145-141, Dave Moretti 144-141, and Hal Miller 143-142. The fight was promoted by Don King. Need we say no more? Was Wilfred bothered? Absolutely not. And he said after the fight, I was too strong. I have a radar in my eyes. Nobody in boxing have my style. I'm the king of style. All ready for Marvin Hagler on June the 29th. At the post-fight conference, Wilfred was generous about Duran, who he described as one of his boyhood idols. While Duran was seated next to Benitez, he then said that the glory of the victory belonged to Latin American boxing and all the Puerto Ricans. Now, in a Ring magazine cover story entitled What's Next for the Triple Crown Champ, compatriot and former light heavyweight king Jose Torres wrote, he anticipates punches as if he had a highly sophisticated radar hidden somewhere in his soul. He moves and punches with the confidence of a seasoned master, incapable of making one single mistake. His performances are overwhelming, but then you get him outside the ring and his nothingness underwhelms you. It becomes quite difficult for him to form an intelligent conversation. Now, a fight with Tommy Hearns was being negotiated by the summer of 1982. Accordingly, Emmanuel Stewart informed United Press International that the Hearns-Benitez fight was a done deal in principle and would likely take place in October in Las Vegas, and he explained, "This is the fight we've had in the background all the time. We could have taken it any time we wanted, but Thomas purposely wanted to get Hagler for personal reasons. He felt it would give him more credibility." Then at a press conference on November the 16th, promoter Don King confirmed December the 3rd, 1982 as the fight date at the New Orleans Superdome.
And I'll just got to say that how good Benitez was, and Jose's comments, Jose Torres' comments. I think when he was saying he's not very sophisticated to talk to, it's because of his broken English. It wasn't his first language, so he didn't have the best of English. Hence, probably why me and Sean sometimes struggle to read some of his quotes. Just to clear that up. So the winner of Hearns and Benitez would face the undisputed middleweight champion, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, at the beginning of the new year. Then about a week before the fight, Don King, good old dodgy Don King, convinced all the boxers on the card to accept purse reductions due to lagging ticket sales. Hearns and Benitez, who had signed to fight for $1.5 million each, took a pay cut of quarter of a million. Initially, promoters hoped to attract a crowd of 40,000 to the Superdome in New Orleans. However, estimated attendance was just 12,000. The fight was shown on HBO pay-per-view and at 150 closed circuit locations. During the lead up to the fight, a journalist asked Wilfred about the rumours that he had only been working or training for 3 weeks. And Benitez scoffed, "This happens all the time. I'm in great shape. People say this because they don't want to see me win. I'm too good though. And in this fight, I will show my ability. After this fight, I will be recognised." He then boasted, "I will kill Hearns. Yes, I will kill him." Manny Stewart responded calmly and positively about the champion. He said, "Benitez is not the puncher that Leonard was. He doesn't have a single punch that can turn a fight around. He is a great boxer and he has great stamina. And his place in boxing is written in stone." Hearns was more mature about his prediction. He said, "When I fight, people expect to see a knockout. Well, they're only going to see one if Benitez does something stupid. If he tries to draw a shot and counter over it, then he'll be on the canvas. But I expect it to go the full 15 and I'm going to give him a boxing lesson."
This time we're actually going to use parts of a New York Times article for the fight description. Now, the first few rounds were an opportunity for each fighter to display their boxing ability. Hearns kept the champion at arm's length with a stiff left jab that reddened his face, but Benitez also effectively slipped many punches with deft head and shoulder feints. He wasn't able to counter Hearns as his right hands were short or glanced off Hearns' chest. Hearns had a point deducted in the fourth for pulling Benitez's head down, but by the fifth round, he was in command. He hooked off his jab and followed with straight right hands. Benitez backed into the ropes like a spider trying to lure a fly into his web. Hearns would not follow him. He backpedaled to the centre of the ring and motioned Benitez to come out and fight. Late in the fifth round, a right hand staggered Benitez and his glove touched the canvas. It was ruled a knockdown by referee Octavio Mayron, who gave Benitez an 8 count. Hearns admitted, "I don't really think it was a knockdown. He blocked most of the punch. When I knock someone down, they don't get up that quickly." Although Benitez still was having trouble getting inside, he started to throw more punches. A left hand caught Hearns on the side of the face in the 7th. In the 8th, he landed with a left hook and right hand lead. Hearns merely smiled and continued to dance the night away. It was in the 8th round that he damaged his hand, but he never informed Emanuel Stewart, who later said, "He never told me that until after the fight."
And in the 9th round, Benitez scored what a television replay showed to be a phantom punch or phantom knockdown. While eluding a left hand, which missed him by several inches, Hearns stumbled and fell, and Myran called it a knockdown. Thus, Benitez won the round. Wilfred admitted, "I no hit him, but as he started to fall, I think he tried to kick me, so I stepped on his foot." So the exchange in the centre of the ring early in the 10th round whetted the fans' appetite. But by the end of that round, Hearns reverted to jabbing and moving while Benitez pursued cautiously. The final rounds were like instant replays. Benitez was landing more often now, but Hearns still kept him off balance with the jab and his side-to-side movement. Occasionally, Hearns threw a left hook too, but his right hand was virtually non-existent. Just before the start of the 15th round, Gregorio sent his son out with these words of advice. Just take it easy, you got the fight. Across the ring, Emmanuel Stewart was actually urging Hearns to go for it, basically, and Stewart said, "You feel tired?" "No," replied Hearns. "Well, throw that right. I don't know how they got it scored, but the only official I can see is the referee, and he makes me awfully worried." Hearns had outboxed the master of boxing, the Bible of boxing, and lifted the Puerto Rican's WBC Super welterweight title from him by a majority decision. Judge Lou Filippo gave it to nobody, 142-142, while the others, Teddy Castellano, 144 to 139, and Dick Young, 146 to 136, an absolute landslide, had Tommy Hearns, the winner. And with his arm around the victor, Wilfred Benitez was supremely gracious during the HBO post-fight interviews, although his father was pissed. The judges are a bunch of crooks. For the last 7 or 8 rounds, the other guy was on his bicycle with his right hand stuck up his backside, and they take the title away from the 3-time world champion.
Gregorio also ruled out a rematch and said, "Who needs it? One robbery is enough. One thing Hearns does is run, and if a boxer who runs can't beat a triple champion, who needs him? I saw Cassius Clay run, and they gave it to him. Maybe everybody just wants to destroy boxing. We fight Marvin Hagler. If not him, then I tell Wilfred to retire." In his dressing room, Benitez's mother gently wiped the sweat from her son's face and said, "You have nothing to be ashamed of." Then she kissed him on the cheek and said, "Un besito para el nene," she said softly, which is translated into "a kiss for a child." Weeks after losing his crown in January 1983, Wilfred married Elizabeth Alonso, his childhood sweetheart, who lived across the street from the Benitez family home in Carolina. It was a union that drove a wedge between father and son and divided the family in a way that never truly healed, according to Wilfred's mother, Clara. With Goyo disapproving of the relationship, the newlyweds moved to New York City, where Wilfred began working with Victor Mercado and Custy Amato with a view to resuming his career at middleweight. Wilfred sadly said, "My father showed me how to take care of myself when I am not with him, but my father is taking care of business in Puerto Rico. He's doing good. Someday he'll be in my corner again. Never should a son give his back to his father. I trust my father. I believe in him." In May 1983, Benitez took a unanimous decision against Tony Serda, and Pat Putnam called his performance dismal. Then Jim Jacobs decided that a fight against the WBC's #1 contender at middleweight, Mustafa Hamsho, was a fight that made sense, and he said, "What have we got to lose? If Wilfred beats Hamsho, then we fight for the middleweight title. If we lose, we'll still be the mandatory challenger to Hearns for the junior middleweight championship."
Well, the 12-round eliminator was made for July 16 at the outdoor stadium at the Dunes Hotel on a Don King promotion billed as July Fist Explosion. Now, according to Custy Amato, Wilfred had more power than boxing people gave him credit for, and he declared that now Benitez can punch a lot harder than people think. But he doesn't punch. He just comes out to outbox his opponent with his smarts. I talked to him about moving side to side and punching. With Hamsho coming on a straight line, Benitez can move to the side and hit him with maximum power and not be afraid of being hit because Hamsho won't be in a position to hit him. Unfortunately for Benitez and Cuss, the fight didn't go as expected, and Tim Dahlberg of the Associated Press reported Benitez was thoroughly dominated by Hamsho, the WBC's top-ranked challenger, who used his strength and brawling style to pin Benitez in his corner through much of the bout in taking a unanimous 12-round decision. From the opening bell, when Hamsho backed Benitez into the corner, he dominated the fight, throwing punches from every direction while Benitez answered with only weak counter punches that had little effect on Hamsho. Neither fighter seemed seriously hurt during the bout, although Benitez appeared stunned in the third round when he was pushed or wrestled to the canvas 4 times. Referee David Pearl ruled no knockdowns and warned Hamsho to stop pulling and pushing Benitez. Jim Jacobs said the result was due to the size rather than any technical ability. You keep moving up and up until finally you reach a plateau where the people are stronger and tougher. Hamsho was much stronger than Wilfred. I think this fight dictated that Wilfred will fight at junior middleweight. The 101-degree temperature in an outside ring in the middle of the afternoon, though, was also a terrible move from his team. Fighting a bigger fighter, a natural middleweight, it was always going to end up one way, and that was defeat.
The next time Wilfred stepped into the ring was 7 months later on the undercard of Thomas Hearns' first defence of the WBC light middleweight title. It was without his manager Jacobs, who had sold the fighter his contract back. He laboured to victory over Stacey McSwain and then reunited with his father. Now with a newborn daughter to support, Wilfred and Gregorio Benitez were trying to get back into world title contention. They travelled to the Stade Louis II in Monaco to face the former WBA light middleweight champion Davey Moore on July the 14th, 1984. The fight was aired live on ABC and fought in front of a crowd of 3,000 fans. Now before the fight, Benitez declared, "This year I will become the first boxer in history to win a 4th world championship. I'm going to beat Marvin Hagler. Moore's tough, but he's young. He cannot win. It's a new beginning for me in boxing. I call this fight my last chance." William Knack wrote this on the fight for Sports Illustrated. 2 minutes into the first round, Benitez threw a jab and Moore fired his right over the top, hitting Benitez flush on the potato. Wilfred crumbled, his ankle broken. He got up shaking his head, trying to clear it and blinking wildly. His eyes glassy. He staggered and shook his right leg and retreated to his corner. Moore pounced on him, but Benitez put on a masterful display of defence, ducking and slipping most of Moore's bombs. In the second, Benitez stuck to his corner and Moore teed off. He missed often, but finally caught Benitez with a left hook and staggered him with another right. That was when Lucia stopped it at 1 minute and 18 seconds into the round.
Well, the fact that he had survived on his feet seemed to please Benitez, and to be fair, he busted his ankle. He said, "I don't know how I did it. I didn't get hurt. I'm clean. I should have won. I know I could have beat him. I know I can fight as a middleweight and become a champion. I'll have to continue training," basically. And Gregorio, well, he offered his explanation for the decline now in his youngest son's career. He said, "I think he got too many problems, you know. He got too many problems in his house, serious problems. I think his mind was over there. And the way he was talking today on television, he said, every time I go in the ring, I think about my daughter and my wife. That's not the way to talk as a fighter. When he go in the ring, to think about his family, because if he's thinking about his family, he can't win." Well, a couple of days later, it was confirmed that Wilfred Benitez had broken his right ankle in 3 places. Yet at the age of 25, it seemed like Wilfred Benitez's career was over. Wilfred's mother, Clara, was actually speaking with her son over the telephone and said, "But he's positive. He's in it to stay. He has no intention of retiring." She then quoted him as saying, "I lost, but I feel as though I've won." Strange comment there, but the truth was Wilfred was in financial ruin. Even though he had earned about $7 million, William Knack believed he had squandered that fortune just as he had his talent. Then he went on to write that he had come to Monte Carlo so deeply in debt to the US government that he might never get out. And Bob Arum simply said he didn't pay his taxes.
For this fight, Benitez earned $60,000 to Moore's $110,000. Benitez told Sports Illustrated that he had found a new purpose in life after marrying his childhood sweetheart, and in their 3-month-old daughter, Benitez said, "She brought me back to discipline. I was sleeping for 24 years. I have waked up." However, it had been rumoured that when Benitez and his wife moved to New York, Gregorio said his son had a six-figure amount in the bank. As proof, he showed a reporter a chemical bank statement showing over $200,000 in liquid assets. The losses, both in the ring and in his bank account, started shortly after the marriage, he said. 3 successive victories followed after the Moore defeat against very modest opponents, and even in one of those bouts, Benitez was floored and showing no punch resistance, which was very unlike Wilfred. The fight that followed against Matthew Hilton in Montreal, Canada, on February the 15th, 1986, was nothing short of a horror film. The knockout is explained by the author of The Fifth King, The Rise and Fall of Wilfred Benitez, Ben Doherty, and it reads, "The end came in the dying seconds of round 9 when a huge left hook separated Benitez from his senses and sent him crashing to the canvas on his left side for the full count. The disturbing whiplash effect of the coup de grace gave rise to concerns amongst all but the most insensitive observers, but Wilfred was able to leave the ring under his own steam within minutes. Anybody who truly cared about him could only hope it was for the last time. It wasn't, and it's crazy to think that he was no longer a world-class fighter, even though he was only in his mid-20s. His mother said of the Hilton fight, "I felt those punches too. I told him it was time to stop."
However, Wilfred fought on. 2 decisions in July and September 1986 before accepting another fight to end the year in Salta, Argentina. His mother repeated her words to her son to stop fighting, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. "But Mum," he said while grabbing her hand, "I want to visit the homeland of Carlos Monzon." Just before Wilfred set off for Argentina, he told reporters, "The fight with Herrera, who's going to be his opponent, is much more important to me than you think, since I am working to get a new world title, so I cannot admit setbacks along the way." This was a significant moment in the career and the life of Wilfred Benitez. So to help us explain, we will use descriptions from Jose Corpes's article in The Sweet Science and author Ben Doherty's in his book The Fifth King, The Rise and Fall of Wilfred Benitez. When Benitez arrived in Salta, Argentina, he was expecting to actually fight a guy called Miguel Ango Arroyo and stay for just a few weeks. Instead, he fought another guy, Carlos Herrera, and stayed for more than a year. A local reporter, Roberto Vitri, attended the weigh-in, and in his opinion, Benitez was a shot fighter. In fact, he said Benitez had failed the pre-fight physical. There was an equilibrium test before each fight where boxers were told to form an X with their arms across their chest and stand on one leg. He couldn't do it. Everyone in the room looked at each other in dismay, but did nothing. Vitri also said his license to box in Puerto Rico had been suspended, but despite the suspension and the failed medical, Benitez was cleared to box. How much training he did is unknown, but what most people witnessed was Wilfred Benitez eating large steaks and boiled vegetables and attending mass.
When it came to the fight, it was said that Benitez needed help climbing into the ring before going on to lose by a 7th-round knockout. But what happened next is subject to opinion. It would seem that Wilfred was never paid for his fight in Argentina and was stranded because the promoter stole his passport. The promoter of the fight was Miguel Herrera, and he denied this claim, although admitted to paying Wilfred late. He said Benitez eventually got every penny of the $14,000 he was owed, plus more, and that Benitez stayed in Salta voluntarily. He explained that Benitez had told him if he stepped foot in Puerto Rico again, he would be thrown in jail for an outstanding debt. In an interview from his home just before his death, Herrera said Benitez would show up at his office asking for money, but he'd instruct his staff to hand him a few pesos and not let him in. Herrera said, "The mistake was mine. I gave him money so I didn't have to see him. At one point, my family told me, Benitez, or us, it's driving you crazy." He said that he paid Wilfred's hotel bill for months and his mother cooked meals for him. When Herrera's father died, they held the wake in their living room and Benítez, as he did in the ring against Leonard and Hearns during the referee's instructions, stood in front of the casket, locked eyes on it, and stared without flinching. Apparently, for 24 hours, he stood there without talking or sitting. Yet another source suggested that Herrera had withheld a substantial portion of Wilfred's purse and retained his passport due to his disappointment in his poor performance. Now, while Wilfred lived in Salta for a year, the locals got to know him, and it wasn't long until his infectious personality shone through.
Yeah, Wilfred became affectionately known as El Morento, which translates into the cute little brown guy. Herrera said Wilfred pretended that he couldn't speak or understand Castilian, but I knew he did. Benitez spent his days living like a homeless man, walking up and down the streets, telling anyone who would listen that he was still waiting for his pay and that his passport had been stolen. After a few months, the promoter said he cut Benitez off, so he spent the rest of his days in Argentina sleeping rough and asking for handouts. Apparently, and we honestly don't know how true and accurate this is, but at times Wilfred was seen by people sprinting at top speed throughout the streets until he collapsed on the ground from just sheer exhaustion. After resting, he would get up again and run some more. None of this year can accurately be accounted for, and the truth is we will never really know what happened. But it really is just so sad that at 28, a man who should have been at the peak of his career and his powers was just left on his own, and it just doesn't make any sense. However, more stories have slowly emerged to help us fill in some of those gaps. Now, in either December 1987 or March 1988, depending on your source, a Mr. Leonard Gonzalez arrived in Salta, Argentina, to collect the depleted national treasure. Herrera said one day a man from Puerto Rico showed up, and Gonzalez told Herrera he was sent by the government to bring Benitez back, and showed him a check and asked, "What do we owe you, Mr. Herrera, for your troubles?" When Gonzalez actually examined Wilfred Benitez, he said he was underweight, malnourished, and incoherent. And with that, he returned to Puerto Rico. Now, whether Wilfred was ever paid or how much is still a mystery.
His wife said she had a contract showing the amount offered was $25,000 and that the promoters never came close to matching that amount. It was also revealed that she had been communicating with him while he was in Argentina and that she instructed him not to return until he collected the entire $25,000. Upon returning home, the former three-weight champ was checked into a hospital where he remained for a couple of weeks. When he was released from the hospital, it was reported that he began training Olympic hopefuls that paid a salary of $800 per month, but there is no evidence of such job. The local commission then took the decision to retire him because they said he was in no condition to box. Then just over 3 years later, since his last bout in Argentina, and despite showing signs of suffering from post-traumatic encephalitis, Benitez was back in the ring, awaiting the opening bell at a Phoenix motel. His opponent was a fighter with 0 wins in his career, and it took him 7 rounds to get the knockout win. 2 months later, now under the tutelage of Emmanuel Stewart, Wilfred fought in an indoor football arena on East 36th Street in Tucson, Arizona, against Irish Pat Lawler, which ended in a split decision defeat. Before leaving Arizona, he filed for divorce and then headed north for his final 2 fights. In August 1990, Benitez won a decision and then lost by a decision a month later in his final professional fight. He finished his career with a record of 53 wins, 31 by knockout, and 8 defeats with 1 draw. On March 5, 1996, Gregorio Benitez Sr. died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage the day before the 20-year anniversary of his son's greatest triumph. 2 years earlier, he had split with his wife Clara.
So Benitez, as in Wilfred Benitez, while living back at home in Puerto Rico and going through those divorce proceedings, he asked his mother for a piece of cake before she finished even slicing a piece of cake. She actually found her son on the floor vomiting and in convulsions. Wilfred damaged by the onset of pugilistic dementia, was 38 when he collapsed on his mother's living room floor and slipped into a coma. Lying stricken when doctors arrived, his family were told to prepare for the worst. 6 years after his final bout, Benitez was in a physical and mental dire straits. He was taken to hospital Universitario in Rio Pedras and remained in a coma for about a week. He survived the coma, but his demise continued. He never fully recovered and spent the following years under the supervision of his mother, his sister, Yvonne, and medical professionals. While the family hoped for a miracle, his health deteriorated. He could no longer dress himself or tie his own shoes, but there were moments when he could still shadow box when asked. After suffering a stroke years later, he rarely ventured much further than the front of the house. According to his family, his daughter, who still lived across the street, visited him less frequently, and at times he was difficult to understand. Following the bright days, he surprised family and friends by singing Hector Lavoe, if I pronounce that right, Hector Lavoe songs and cheering for Miguel Cotto. More often were the sleepless days and nights when Wilfred would fall into a depression and burst into tears. His sister, we couldn't quite establish which one, but his sister admitted, "He told me to kill him with a gun." Very, very sad indeed. So with all his millions gone, he was almost entirely dependent on the $1,125 a month that he received from the Puerto Rican government, and Senator Ramon Luis Rivera, who had sponsored the bill to give the ex-champion an annual pension of $7,200, explained his decision in wanting to help him.
He said Wilfred lost everything. Even if he lost the money, he brought fame to Puerto Rico at one time, and many people enjoyed that fame. Now he's in a critical situation. Why not give him a little help? Also living at the family home with Mum was Gregorio Jr. and Frankie, who both suffered from less severe but still substantial forms of dementia pugilistica. Shortly after Frankie's 40th birthday, Wilfred began to lash out and break things, so Clara was advised to put him in care for his own safety and for others. For the next 10 years, he lived between the care of medical professionals in assisted living and his mother and sister during spells at home. When his mother Clara passed away on July 25, 2008, Wilfred's sister Yvonne became his sole carer in St. Just. His health has continued to deteriorate after being diagnosed with diabetes and suffering a stroke. Today, he lays immobile in a bed with almost no friends and few visitors. A paraplegic surrounded by medical equipment with failing vision and little to no memory. His body is shutting down. His radar is malfunctioning. He struggles to recognise his family, his carers. He cannot control his bodily functions. The sport that made him a king has stripped him of his soul. It's an incredibly sad ending, and we would like to encourage you guys listening, and anybody that listens to this episode, to try and help Wilfred in any way possible by highlighting where you can go to do this. Chris Smith, who has been a source for this episode, he sent out a message on his social media after recently visiting Wilfred Benitez, and this is what it reads. For my birthday, I want to help raise funds to assist Wilfred Benitez. His sister Yvonne is his caregiver, and her goals are to see him walk again and move them from their second-floor apartment into a home to make things as comfortable as possible.
The message continued that Benitez is an icon in world boxing, the youngest ever world champion at 17, the first Latino boxer to become a three-division champion, and a hero in Puerto Rico. But he suffers degenerative effects from boxing, and with the effect of inflation, physical therapy and housing costs, they need the help. So donations can be sent to 208 Yvonne Benitez at gmail.com, and that's 208, that's YVONNE, and Benitez as in BENITEZ at gmail.com. Please, if you can help, it would be massively appreciated by obviously Yvonne, the rest of the family, And all we can do and what we will try to do is just keep promoting so we can give something back to an icon, as Chris said, an absolute icon of the sport. But we can't end this life story, this career profile on Wilfred Benitez on this. We must end on a positive note, starting with Chris Smith, who said when Wilfredo Gomez would call him on the phone, even though Benitez can't communicate, he knew it was Gomez talking and just liked hearing his voice. Benitez was one of the greatest Puerto Rican fighters of all time. He probably sits just behind Wilfredo Gomez, in my opinion, and Carlos Ortiz, could be pushing him though, but just in front or level with Felix Tito Trinidad or Miguel Cotto. I mean, they belong in some great company. Chris Smith also again explains that Benitez was far more famous in America than Wilfredo Gomez and made more money. But in Puerto Rico itself, Gomez was and is far more popular and more famous. He was their boxing god until Tito, who was even more popular than him. Sadly, Benitez is very forgotten there. Gomez was always in the tabloids and on TV, but Benitez was making bigger purses due to being in bigger fights. Wilfred is arguably one of the greatest defensive fighters to ever grace a boxing ring. He was a devious fighter, insincere in his moves. Benitez misled, deceived, tricked and lied his opponents as he offered them something to hit, but when they knocked, nobody was home.
Pat Putnam, who was featured quite a lot throughout this episode, had this to say on Wilfred's defensive mastery and said, when at his best defensively, he could lie down on the San Diego freeway at 5 p.m. and not get run over. Sugar Ray Leonard admitted after his fight with El Radar that Benitez had successfully slipped his best shots and countered him all night. The reason Benitez is generally denied entry into the Leonard, Hagler, Hearns, Duran 4 Kings Club is because he never shared a ring with Marvellous Marvin Hagler, thus making his membership incomplete. But we should all know better, really. Custy Amato also said this of Wilfred Benitez. Many times a fellow has an intuitive sense that tells him, get the hell out of there. Benitez has this to an extraordinary degree. When his intuitive sense tells him that a punch is coming, he has already started to move. Floyd Patterson used to look at the muscles on his opponent's chest, the pecs, which cause the arm to move, to get advance warning of when and where a punch is coming from. Benitez does the same thing and almost casually gets out of the way. A split second before the punch is even thrown, he's already slipping it and retaliating with his own counterpunch. And lastly, we will finish with the West Coast correspondent, Steve Vender of Boxing News, who wrote this on Wilfred. One simply doesn't watch Benitez when he moves. You study him, whether he is under pressure from one of his sparring partners in the ring, or simply santering down the hallway on the way back to his room. Benitez is a man whose movement is so full of subtleties that to gain any hint of his mood or feelings, you must study him like you would a clever and capable animal. And that there ends the career profile of Wilfred Benitez, Johnston. One hell of an episode. I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. The part that I've not enjoyed, and this is being totally honest with everybody listening, is finding out how bad the situation is for him at the moment and his life. Yeah. Most of the time when we do career profiles, a lot of the fighters, are usually in a really good position, or they've passed on because we've covered fighters from many different eras and many different years. So we're able to give that sort of full and complete ending and really think about the impacts that they've had on the sport. And we will do that with Wilfred, of course. But the one highlighting thing to me is Chris Smith's recent visit to see Wilfred and seeing the photos on social media on Chris Smith's Facebook account. It's quite upsetting to see that there's a fighter who once essentially ruled the world in boxing is so down and practically out that, it's just so sad to see. And it's difficult to see because we love this sport so much. We love covering this sport. People like Wilfred Benitez give so much substance to the history of this sport, which is why we love covering it and covering this show. And to see the position that he's now in, the difficulties that the family now face financially, to be able to get him into a position where he can at least live the remaining years of his life in some sort of comfort, is quite hard to see. So as you rightly said earlier, donations can be made to his sister Yvonne, whose email address we've already read out. Now, please, if you are in a position, you're listening to this from America, because we know a lot of you American listeners and Canadian listeners, and some of you South American listeners, if you're in a position to be able to help the family, please try and do it. It would be gratefully received by them to allow them to put towards trying to get him into a better position. It's really sad that he's in the position he's in. But having said all that, moving that aside for 1 minute, I just wanted to say how much I've enjoyed covering his career again, how much I've enjoyed revisiting his fights, how much I've enjoyed learning more about a fighter who was one of the greatest of his era, and certainly one of the greatest Puerto Rican fighters of all time.
He really was. And you're right. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because his current situation. And the one thing that stuck with me is we didn't put it in this, but it was one thing Sugar Ray Leonard said, that it was the first time he'd ever gone to visit one of his opponents that was with the health he currently had. And he said it was difficult to see a guy like that in his era. He said he'd seen other fighters previously, like, with Ali and before his decade, before his era, that, but to see a guy he had fought and, he basically called the mirror image of himself, to see him in the position he was in, he said it was shocking. And it took his breath away a bit. But then when he sat down and he said then he's actually had the fight on of Leonard Benitez, which is a great fight, by the way. Do go and watch that on YouTube. It's a fantastic fight. And, that is your Crawford Spence of that era. That's basically what that was. But he said when they sat down and that fight come on, he said Benitez's eyes lit up just watching the fight. He's there. Just can't do certain things, but he's there. His mind's there. And he said he even sort of said the words was, I never trained for that fight. Again, he said it. And, that's how good he was, Sean. This guy trained pretty much once with pure dedication against Antonio Cervantes when he was, 17 years old. It's incredible that he barely trained for Sugar Ray Leonard and pushed him as far as he did. Hardly trained for Duran, beat him. Barely trained from where his hopes sparked him out. The guy's an animal, absolute animal in the ring. And when the Carlos Polino fight as well, my goodness me, what a fight that is. It is, how Cassell says it, it's one of the greatest performances he's seen. I can't say it enough. I watched this fight. I was watching it and I fell asleep and I watched it again. And I've probably watched it now about 3 times since we've done this episode, Sean. And it is just stunning. The way he's like a cobra. The way he can move his head without really moving his feet. His upper body movement, his lateral movement, the way he evades shots. It's just superb. Absolutely superb. And the way Pat Putnam described his defensive mastery, where he can lay on a freeway and still not get run over. That is bang on, mate. What a superstar. Seriously, if he was around today, everybody would salivate about Wilfred Benitez and wouldn't have no problem at all sticking him in as the 5th king. And because he didn't get the Hagler fight, he doesn't sort of fit in there. But I think we've got to keep banging the drum. We've got to keep banging the drum for him now as well, to help him, get him moved into a property where he can try and thrive a bit in his life. And Yvonne, I mean, it must be so tough for her and the family. So, yeah, and the other brothers as well. I mean, there's all the elephant in the room, though, Sean, is obviously people will say, from the young age he was, would he be in a position he was now if he was fighting, if he hadn't fought so early in his life? The one thing I will say is, when you look at Jake LaMotta, the guy lived to 90, how many whacks did he take? I do think sometimes it makes you wonder if it's like a genetic thing because of his brothers as well having the same problem, where maybe your punch resilience, the further you go on in life, I don't know, you can't live a normal life afterwards. Other fighters can go through and have as much punishment and still live a normal life and be coherent. And it's a tough one, isn't it? It's really sad, but I think the story of Wilfred presents the story of boxing. That's the risk you take when you step into that ring, people.
It is certainly the risk you take when you get into that ring. And we've seen what Trish Dixon's done with his book on the effects of CTE, and it's a very interesting book to read about. And I think the effects of CTE were probably very evident with Benitez a lot earlier on, and the amount of punishment he probably took earlier on would have certainly had an effect on how he ended up. And it wouldn't have been known then. And that's the issue. It wouldn't have been known. It's only really just kind of come to light over the past 10 years where people have really started to focus on CTE and the effects of it and all the studies that have come out and the research that's been done on it. And I think, if we would have known that then, would the risks have been put to Benitez and to anyone else who was around at that time. But then, like you say, there's a lot of science behind it. There's genetics that play a factor in it. And you think of certain fighters that you label who have been in the ring and live a practically normal life. 9 times out of 10, you will get a fighter with some type of ailment who's been in the ring for that length of time, that has taken that many clean blows to the head. Eventually, it is going to come to fruition. It happened to many of other fighters we can speak about. But for Benitez, it's put him into this position now where he needs the support, his family needs the support. But I hope that you guys listening, you've been able to really enjoy his story in terms of his boxing career, in terms of what he brought to boxing, in terms of who he was, in terms of how good he was in the ring. Yes, we can look at the fact that his fall was a little bit of a fall from grace, but what he did in the time that he was at his peak and at his prime, for me, it goes unrivaled in that particular era. You can talk about Ray Leonard, you can talk about Hagler and Hearns and Duran and everybody else around, your Aaron Pryors, your Alexis Arguellos of the time. Wilfred Benitez made his mark in boxing. He writ his name in stone in boxing history, and that is what is important, and that is what we enjoy covering for our shows. And I hope that everybody listening to this show has been able to listen to the story and hear all the funny moments and hear the training or lack of training and the different moments of his relationship with his father and the relationship with Jacobs and Caton, and especially the hilarious conversations from Mike Tyson about what he was like when he went up to the Catskills. I mean, it's absolutely hilarious to go through that and hear that from Tyson's perspective. But genuinely, I hope you guys have really enjoyed the episode on Wilfred Benitez. If you have, always let us know by commenting on the post on social media. If you're on Twitter, you'll find us at career_profiles or at BTR Boxing Pod. If you're following us on any other social platform, it is at BTR Boxing Podcast Network. We finally want to give a shout out to the patrons from patreon.com for supporting us separately and subscribing to us separately to allow us to create new content, to allow us to create more research and well-developed content, and in return giving you guys access to these shows earlier, giving you ad-free versions of them, and giving you your own content that is not released to the general public. Thank you for supporting us as always. And again, if you haven't already followed us, you know where to do it now. If you haven't subscribed to the show, whichever platform you're listening to us on, please make sure you subscribe. And if you do see any videos, any social posts about any of these episodes, please always like, share and retweet. It is really appreciated. And that is everything for our show, guys. Thank you so much for listening to the career of the Bible of Boxing El Radar, Wilfred Benitez.